Hello and welcome to the Hacking Safe podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is the writer as well as one of the voices behind the Horizons Review, Kyle Housley. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Alex. Yeah.
Thanks for coming on. So you recently started a podcast with a good friend of mine, an OG, old head of Twitter, and frequent guest on my programs, Cody Moser. So I thought we'd start by just talking a little bit about that new endeavor that you two have embarked on as co-hosts, kind of what inspired it and what you've created so far and what you plan on talking about.
Yeah, this came up like mostly from Cody's encouragement. We had been talking about stuff that he had been working on related to his PhD thesis, which he recently defended and he's graduated now. And I had brought up some other books that he might want to look into that he might not have considered because they were a little bit lesser known. Um, One of them was, which was our first episode, was John Henry Newman's Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. Like Newman himself is very well known. This is probably one of his least read books because it's just very dense and strange. And it's mostly a work of epistemology, even though it's sort of also a work of Catholic apologetics. But the epistemology part was what interested both of us about this book. And so we just got to talking. And we're like, yeah, there's all these uh, different strands of, like, we can pull into contemporary debates from different works or like different ideas. And we started talking like, well, maybe we should do something like a podcast to get this out there eventually. And I sort of bit the bullet, like figured out how to get the podcasting software set up, and we've just been slowly moving forward at the pace of about an episode a month so
Cool. And
far.
and, and so what are you guys trying to do with this? Why put these conversations out there?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. Like, I mean, partly I think the reason that anyone does this sort of thing is because they find it fun. Like, I don't, I don't think, you go out here like into this space, at least not in the sort of like more intellectual academic space of doing podcasting, like because you want to be a star, or be an influencer, or get rich somehow. Like you're doing it because you just find it fun. And I do think that is the main reason. Like we're doing it because it's fun. We enjoy talking to each other. We enjoy talking about these things. And the other thing is too is like, we've both found these ideas and these books useful to some sense in our lives. And, if other people get inspired to pick these things up that we're talking about, like that's great. Like that would be the optimal objective of the podcast, would be getting people to read things that they might not have considered approaching in the past.
Okay, cool. So, kind of just an intellectual exploration, maybe flexing your muscles a little bit and getting some of these ideas, especially by maybe lesser known or not as popular thinkers, kind of out there.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
All
Or like
right.
revisiting, yeah, stuff that might have been influential but has fallen by the wayside would be another thing.
Yeah, I mean that's a general problem, I guess, with intellectual life, I would say more broadly, which is that, really outside of the academy, in many ways it's kind of died, at least in the terms of the popular culture, right? Like
Yeah.
there used to be an expectation that uh, if you were a learned person, if you had gone to school, there would be certain texts, certain thinkers you would be familiar with, and there would also be certain contemporaries that you would be sort of keeping up on. And these days, that assumption outside of really academia is totally gone by the wayside.
Yeah. And within academia, like I would say, like there's this other sort of push that happens where so many, like getting funding, like finding a program, things can be very, very fad dependent. So like doing these sorts of like long projects where you delve into something that might not be popular at the moment, like you might never see the light of day if you decided to make that your work. Whereas I think there were earlier eras in which there was more tolerance of eccentricity, of someone wanting to do unfashionable work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in general, I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people that maybe would have been in academia in a prior lifetime are no longer or got out pretty quickly, right? It's just this lack of tolerance for, yeah, eccentricity is a good way of saying it. Is, it's very dispiriting, but it also means that uh, the whole system just becomes very regularized. That it's all about publishing um, and even when you're talking about the publishing, like the publish or perish paradigm, you have only certain kinds of things which are expected to be put out there, and it just sort of, it kills a lot of the liveliness and the spiritedness of the endeavor for a lot of
Yeah.
people. So, all right, so you're working on that with Cody's, and that's pretty great. And what else are you doing? You're writing. You've got a piece out on relationships. Talk to me
Yeah.
about that.
That just came up sort of out of the blue. My wife and I were just talking in the morning, and I was like, something that really bothers me is, in general, the way that people have imported language from psychology and specifically from personality disorders to talk about everyday relationships. And one of the things that people do is like, oh, there's this talk about like narcissism, and narcissists engage in transactional relationships, and people sort of treat this idea as like, oh, like you can't ever have any explicit or even implicit give and take in a relationship. If you're ever expecting something out of your partner, like that's like being transactional and you're doing the wrong thing. And I think that that is completely wrong. I think that's applying diagnostic criteria to things that they were never meant to do, like what psychologists mean or should mean about a narcissist being transactional isn't what you normally mean by the fact that like that you're upholding your end of the bargain in a relationship, and there are going to be certain things that you expect from your friend or your wife or your husband in return. um like I think that's completely normal, and I think that being able to engage in that like implicit give and take is actually the whole art of being in relationships in the first place. It's like the art of friendship. It's the art of like being married to someone, having a girlfriend, like whatever. It's knowing how to navigate these things, and sort of pathologizing that, like, I think just hurts people and makes them unhappy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different avenues I could go down with this because I think I definitely see this trend of part of it is this. So one thread in this is that there's this tendency in our culture right now to dismiss away any sense of obligation that you have
Yeah.
towards the people closest to you, right? And that any obligations that you have that are against kind of what you want or what's convenient for you, what you desire, how you want to live are too burdensome, and therefore they're wrong. And then there's the other side of this, which is which is this darker side that you're talking about, where not only are they too burdensome, but there's an element of coercion in them, in just having them at all.
Yeah.
And I think both of this is I agree with you that both of these are very destructive to the functioning of normal, healthy relationships, which do have negotiation and compromise, bargaining, and a sense of reciprocity. And if you don't have any of those things, then I don't really know what we're doing. Like,
Yeah.
like are you just assuming that the person you're with is going to just always be maximally uh, convenient to you, or you're always just going to, maybe you imagine a scenario where the feelings towards one another are so altruistic that even when it's inconvenient for you, you'd still desire to do the right thing. But I
Right.
think that's unrealistic, right?
Yeah, I think like especially between relationships between adults, like I do have an aside. Like I think that the love that parents show children is something different than this,
Mhm.
or at least it often is. Like once again, like parents are imperfect, and sometimes they don't want to do shit for their kid, like whatever. That happens. But in general, like that sort of model where like no, you actually do truly have selfless love for that person, and you're gonna do it even if they're being horrible to you. Like that is the instance where you see that, but that's not a model for like a working partnership between adults. Like if those two people were somehow able to offer that to each other perfectly, like yeah, that's one thing, but like demanding that of someone when you know you aren't giving it in return is, I think, crazy.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So there's this angle of the pathologization of like normal expected behavior in relationships. And there's also this side of like devaluing of relationships just in general,
Yeah,
which is like if you're willing to apply, like to begin to apply these terms almost immediately, then that points to something. It's almost like the culture is interfering with the normal functioning of relationships, or like everyone has to have an opinion about how your relationship should be going.
yeah, yeah. It is kind of funny too because I actually thought about this in relation to what we're going to talk about later, where there's almost this sense of like negative liberty run amok, where it's like the only sort of cognizable form of flourishing for people is your freedom from expectations or
Yeah.
your freedom from things. It's not like your freedom to flourish in a particular sense. It's your freedom from constraint.
Yeah, and I think that the problem with that is that it's a false freedom, right?
Yeah.
Or it's a false sense of like there's no such thing as genuine freedom from constraints. There's only freedom from the constraints that you choose. And if you don't voluntarily apply some constraints to yourself, you end up in another set of constraints that you didn't choose.
Yeah.
If you forgo a relationship, for example, in order to stay single and continue having fun or something like that, you know, it's a free society. You're free to do that, but it actually does come with hidden costs. There is a set of constraints that you're agreeing to that are different.
Yeah, like you don't have this person to navigate life with, or like these other goods that come from relationships that are in some sense free goods that you just don't realize that you're giving up.
Yeah, you're also not really building anything with
Yeah.
someone, right? Like there's no sense of like continuity or compounding meaning meaning just by itself, but also other things that come with a relationship, whether that's leads to marriage, to children, finances, etc. Like if you're just having these very shallow or one-off relationships, or you stay single or whatever, then you're not really building a life with someone, and I think there's a cost to that kind of needs to be acknowledged. And yeah, and then again, it also just points to like the sort of ubiquity of therapy speak brought into everyday life, right? Where it's like everyone's a narcissist, everyone like every girl that dumps you has BPD, every guy that does something you don't like is a narcissist or whatever, and it's just like this what we're doing is we've taken like clinical language, and I think mostly the internet is responsible for just taking the normal dysfunction that goes and pitfalls and struggles that come with human relationships and just turning everything into
Yeah.
a pathology to solve, to be solved.
And I think a lot of this just has to do with like it often seems like the people who comment the most about this stuff online are the people who are the most unhappy. And the people who are the most unhappy are the most likely to probably been in genuinely dysfunctional relationships, and thus like they've learned like these terms from therapy or like trying to work through that. But because they're unhappy, they just sort of like lash out and apply them wildly.
Yeah, yeah. So what is the takeaway from this article? You know, um,
I mean, my goal was like, listen, like, I don't know, it's always difficult writing these things or like talking about these things because to some extent, like my audience on Twitter, like the audience of people who are likely to see this, like is probably already primed to agree with me. Like I'm probably, this is a real problem. Like I'm probably not going to reach anyone who fundamentally disagrees with me. Like the best. Like my hope is I reach someone who just hasn't thought about this explicitly in the past and then goes, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then like the next time their friend starts engaging in this sort of behavior where they're like doing this like rampant, psychologization, which does happen. I've seen it happen socially. They can sort of like turn down, the temperature a little bit on that conversation and say like, okay, well, but yeah, you thought about it this way. Have you thought, so on. Like I think that's like probably the most you can hope for because, like I said, I just think that it's so hard to reach people who do disagree with you. And then when you do reach people who disagree with you, often because of the way the internet is, like they just either don't understand you or they're just like primed to get angry at you because like by disagreeing with them, you've done something harmful.
Sure, sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, so making something explicit that was maybe not
Yeah.
acknowledged before is valuable in and of itself. And also just giving people uh better arguments or better ways to articulate their own position is also
Yeah.
a valuable contribution. So when you and I were discussing about what to talk about a little bit, we mentioned, or you mentioned rather, the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And you've got some experience with sort of, case history on the Second Amendment and maybe a little bit of the theory behind it. And so, I'm in Texas. I don't know where you are, but we have a pretty strong,
Yeah.
position and protections around the Second Amendment here. It's one of the things that I like about this state. It's not at all uncommon for people to have guns, for people to be walking around with guns. There's a lot of laws in place to make sure that, the government can't do a lot to prevent you from getting them. So, but obviously that differs from state to state quite considerably, and even within certain cities in some cases. So, talk to me a little bit about the Second Amendment and, where are we in 2025 with this?
So, I mean, like where we are jurisprudence wise, I think we're very firmly within the scope of 2008, which is the Heller case, which
Mhm.
a lot of people know about. It's the case that overturned a lot of the DC handgun regulations. And like that's the last case that really, I think you could say, like negotiates like the meaning of the Second Amendment in the Supreme Court. There are definitely circuit courts that have tried to take the current jurisprudence in some different directions, which we might be able to talk about. But I would say like the main issues, like what does the amendment mean? Like what is the scope of it? What's the core of the right? I think those are all decided at Heller. And every other case that's come up since is like just kind of negotiating within that sphere. Because like if you look at the two most recent cases, I believe they're still the two most recent cases that have come before the Supreme Court, which are Bondi, which was the unfinished receiver case. So can the government properly regulate these unfinished lower receivers? Which, for those who don't know a lot about guns, like if you have an AR-15, there's only one part of the gun that's actually the gun legally, which
Mhm.
is the lower receiver. And for civilian use, which if you don't have a federal firearms license, like you can only have a semi-automatic lower receiver. But companies were selling these like they would call them like 60%, 70%, 80%. I'm not enough of a AR-15 nerd to know this stuff. Lowers where they were unfinished. And the idea was like, oh, you could like finish out the lower and stuff like that. But like sort of the nudge, nudge, wink, wink part of it was you could finish this in a way such that you could install a select fire switch, which turns it into more of the equivalent of a military rifle where it can fire fully automatic or do burst fire, as well as the semi auto fire that is normal for the civilian platform rifle. So Bondi is one of the cases. The other one's Garland, which I think got a little more coverage at the time, which was the bump stock case. So everyone like thinking about the Vegas shooting, that was where they said no, the ATF can't step in and say that bump stocks are machine guns and regulate them under their existing regulation. Like they didn't close off regulating bump stocks, which is sometimes a confusion that people have about the case. They just close off regulating them under the current schema. But like both these cases don't go and revisit, like I would say, like any of the big issues in Heller. Like they don't, like Heller has a very extensive historical analysis of the Second Amendment, very extensive linguistic analysis. All these things are missing. Like that is, so if you want to understand like where we are in Second Amendment jurisprudence, like I would just say go back and read Heller. Like if you read that case and also read the dissent, I think that's important. Even though I think even a lot of liberal scholars have moved on from the position that is established in the Heller dissent, and are more willing to try to negotiate within the Heller framework. If you read that, you'll go, okay, this is where we are. This is the basis. And I would say there's like two really important takeaways from Heller, both of which I think are wrong on original meaning grounds, but we can go into like why I'm not trying to, by advocating for this, saying like, oh, this is what like originalist jurisprudence should be, because like originalism is a particular discipline that has its own rules that isn't always necessarily about like the strict original meaning of the Constitution. So like the popular caricature is like, oh, you know, originalists just want like women not to be able to vote and black people to be slaves and all this stuff. Like, just want to completely restore 1789 or something is not correct. Typically, like most originalist scholars will treat certain Supreme Court cases, even if they have issues from a quote unquote like originalist perspective, as like still being very controlling precedent. So anyways, there are these two elements of Heller, which I think are kind of wrong from original meaning standpoint. But like I said, I'm not advocating here, but I think why they're wrong is interesting. And one of these is the core holding, which is that the core of the right is self-defense. I don't think this is actually correct about the Second Amendment if you read into the debates at the time and why people thought it was necessary, and also like what the meaning of the so-called prefatory clause is in the Second Amendment. So in Heller, they generally call this the prefatory clause. I would call it the militia clause. Mm-hmm. And this is, you know, so like the Second Amendment is very weird in that it has this prefatory clause. Other amendments don't have these sort of purpose elements like set forth first. And so the Second Amendment starts out by saying a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Yeah. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so there's been a lot of debate, especially in the 20th century, about that opening clause. Like, okay, what does it mean that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state? Like, what is this? What is its purpose? Interestingly enough, like this was mostly latched on to in the 20th century by liberals, like who wanted to read this, and this is very clear in the Heller dissent, as okay, they were reading well-regulated as we would read well-regulated today, which is there's a lot of state regulation around the militia. Mm. Whereas like Heller, I think is completely correct. It just makes the case well-regulated at the time meant what we would mean by well-trained. And they tended to focus, they're like, actually, no, this is not a private right. This is a right that has to do with like the state militias. And there are numerous problems with this, both from like originalist grounds and then also from like a strictly textualist ground, like what this would have meant at the time. Like, I think Heller is also correct. Oftentimes people would say, oh, security of a free state. This means the individual states that make up the republic. So this is what it's talking about. Whereas like Heller makes the case that I think is correct, that when they talk about the security of a free state, they mean the entire polity. Like they mean what we would mean more like by the state rather than a state. And Heller, when it comes to the militia clause, like it's interesting because in the end, like there's this strange paragraph which is dicta, but people have often there a few different times people have tried to get some holding out of this paragraph where the holding the opinion says, okay, well, citizen soldiers today, like they might require sophisticated arms, which are unusual in society at large, to defend against for modern armies. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on. It's like, oh, so like, and we ban arms most useful in military service. Okay, so like the M16. So a select fire AR-15 is the equivalent of an M16. And it says, okay, so these modern developments, they've limited the degree of fit between the prefatory clause and the protected right. And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot you could debate there. That's really like, I don't know. It's like, if I thought about the experience of the United States in the past 25 years almost now, I would say it's shown that small arms are in fact very effective against modern armies. But then there's the question of like, well, is that even exactly the point anyways? Because they're also correct. They reject the idea, which I would say is like the most popular 20th century right-wing view of the Second Amendment, that the Second Amendment is kind of a right to rebellion amendment. Like that particular argument never seemed to have much scholarly purchase, but it's been incredibly influential on like the post-World War II libertarian right. Like the modern militia movement, like that's completely their view of the Second Amendment. It's this right to rebellion kind of amendment. And it's not that protection against the government never comes up in Second Amendment discussion before that. But it doesn't play like nearly the central role. It's not the way that people are thinking about the right. And in fact, if you go back and read some of the state conventions about the Constitution, people will go like, well, of course, government can't create some sort of right to rebellion. Like, you know, they even consider this particular reading and just reject it as kind of absurd. Mm. But it's like, okay, so what was the militia clause doing for these people? Can you actually detach it from what the core of the right was originally? And it goes into all this interesting stuff, like, because the reason this is interesting to me is that the founding period is a lot weirder than we normally learn about it. Like the sort of things people were fixated on, like how they thought, what people were engaged in, was so different from how we are today that it's sometimes hard to imagine. Like I actually one time tried to explain this to a friend. It's like if you go back and read like newspaper pieces from around the time of the revolution, like you get the impression that America was like populated by like a bunch of tradesmen and farmers who were Redditors, except instead of making like pop culture analogies, they were constantly, everything was an analogy to Polybius or Livy. It was like some analogy to Roman history that like occupied a huge amount of space in people's minds. And I think if you don't understand like the way in which most people believe sort of the fall of the Roman Republic happened at the time, or the lessons that they felt like they had learned from the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, like it's very hard to understand why the Second Amendment is structured like it is, and why that they thought it was necessary given the text of the Constitution that we have. Like, why was there no exactly equivalent right in the Articles of Confederation? Like, why does it suddenly become like this necessary element of the new federal Constitution? And it comes about for two reasons.
Well,
and
of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Well, the Bill of Rights basically gets passed almost contemporaneously with the Constitution. So like why did people feel like this was necessary in order for them to sign on to the Constitution.
Hmm.
And it's two major reasons. One is the Constitution gave the federal government now power to call on the militia and organize it and use it if necessary. And it also importantly had a provision to allow for a standing army. And both of these things, but especially the second, were really, really concerning to people. And to simplify the story, so standing armies were really, really looked down upon at the time in a way that's hard for us. Like the contempt that people had for them was hard to understand.
Yeah.
And another thing that's
This
interesting
notion
is
that
like,
you would have a standing army, right?
yeah, they call them mercenaries. It's very,
Mhm.
very common is to
Yeah.
like call them mercenaries. And in fact, when there's one of the, I think
Who
it's
made you king?
yeah. I think I can't. I think it's one of the pamphlets that came out against the Constitution. I can't remember if it was that or in one of the state debates. Someone talks about the fact that the federal government now has power over the militia. They immediately launch into, so you're going to turn the militia into mercenaries. Like their mind immediately leaps to the government is going to like sell American free soldiers to other states to go fight their wars. Like this is how they thought. Um, and so, like, why do they think this way is kind of an interesting question because you can come up with all sorts of contemporary reasons why they might have thought this way, but they almost never enter into people's discussion. It almost always falls back on the Roman example. Like, you could go and say, like, hey, in 1783, at the close of the revolution, elements of the Continental Army showed up and besieged Congress to demand their pay. And you go, oh, yeah, that's maybe a reason that we need to be afraid of a professional soldiery. No one really brings that up. Even the English Civil War case, people bring it up on occasion. They allude to Cromwell, but it's almost like they understand that, well, everyone knows about the new model army and Parliament made this professional army and then it turned into the protectorate and maybe it would have gone to a second civil war because there's a period where after Cromwell dies, it looks very possible that the new model army might divide into like opposing groups of warlords. And it's only because the main commander ends up supporting the restoration that this kind of doesn't happen. Um, so there are all these contemporary reasons that you could come up with. Oh, here's why people are afraid of professional armies. But over and over and over again, it just keeps coming back to Rome. And they look at the their model of like how Rome was at its greatest was when the yeoman citizens of Rome were the bulk of the army. They were called up temporarily, they went out to fight, they fought, they came home. It's the moment that it starts being made up of like a mass of like proles and non-citizens who are professionalized and paid a regular salary. Like that to them leads inevitably to the point that Caesar has a group of people who are more loyal to him than to the Republic, and the Republic falls. Like you can tell a story about how the citizen militia of Rome, if that's what you want to call it, led to that situation instead. But as far as I know, no one came up with this theory, even though it's plausible, until the 19th century. Like no one was sitting there saying, oh, well, it's because they had yeoman soldiers and then their yeomanry was killed off
Mm.
in multiple wars, which allowed people to consolidate estates and then created this deeper divide between rich and poor, and then inevitably led to this situation. But no one, as far as I can tell, like no one at the founding period had come up with that particular idea. Like they were all very, very stuck on the idea that like, no, this is the story of the fall of Rome. And they really identified with the Roman Republic, which also I think
Yeah.
is an interesting difference between today and now and then is that, you know, the meme last year, you know, how often does your boyfriend think about the Roman Empire sort of thing? Like
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
do think about the empire a lot and they
Mhm.
think about the transition from the republic, the immediate transition of from the republic to the empire. They think about the Rubicon to Augustus is like still this era that holds a lot of fascination for people, but that's sort of like all those decades of civil war and factionalism that lead up to the moment that Caesar crosses the Rubicon, those aren't as much a part of the popular picture of how the people who are thinking about the Roman Empire 7 times a day, are thinking about the Roman Empire as much these days. But that was the part that people were thinking about in 1789.
Right, right. So I mean, this has been a wonderful history lesson here. I didn't expect us to go in this direction. And it's funny because I think I got a taste of this in my political philosophy education, but that was definitely not the norm, Like we were reading Livy and we read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist papers pretty extensively. And there was there was this acknowledgement of the heavy influence of the Roman Republic on the founding fathers, especially. Not so much uh, you know, the yeomen of early
Yeah.
America. But tying this into their conception of the Second Amendment, I think is extremely interesting, right?
Yeah.
When you think about it, when you begin to put yourself in their shoes and imagine it as their they have an affiliation, an association of themselves to the early Roman Republic,
Yeah.
and they're concerned with with standing armies, and they're concerned with these mercenaries, and it really does start to change the shape of this right that they're trying to project. Now,
Yeah.
I want to get a little bit into some of the things that you said like way back.
Yeah, yeah, we can,
Um,
yeah. I talked for a while, so we can definitely backtrack because there's a
so,
lot to unpack. Yeah.
so you
On
say
that.
that you take issue with and again, for those listening, this is back to the Heller case, with the interpretation of the prefatory clause that is, for the purposes of maintaining a well-regulated militia, blah blah blah. But for different reasons than liberals do. So liberals traditionally use this prefatory clause as a way to sort of to bring in more state regulation, to kind of batter the sort of ideas around self-defense. And you say that, in this ruling, self-defense is explicated as a major function of this right.
Yeah.
So where is I'm trying to get I would like you to pinpoint where exactly your your disagreement is on this point, and why it's different than the
Yeah.
normal liberal critique, but doesn't quite fit with the traditional conservative position.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things in here. And to note, like, and we can go back to this particular thing. I don't think any of the justices at the time of Heller or any of them on the court right now, with the possible exception of Thomas, and I'm saying this for a very concrete reason, not just, haha, Clarence Thomas is so based. I do think that there's like some signaling that he's done in the past that he might be open to this. But like, even Heller itself like concedes the point that the Second Amendment was codifying an existing right, that people already had the right to keep and bear arms. Like all the people involved in the founding, like they knew their Blackstone very, very well. And Blackstone talks about the right to bear arms as like one of the fundamental rights of Englishmen. And like that's how they thought of it. And they would have thought of the right as self-defense, not
Mhm.
as being something that would have been necessary to outline in the Constitution. They would have thought of the right to self-defense as being something that was well defined at common law. Because they would have said, oh, well, the tradition of common law shows that if you use arms in defense of your home or your family or your person, like that's generally exculpatory. Like you
Yeah.
get off. So they would have seen the Second Amendment as not really being about self-defense because that they would have understood as already being there. I so sort of like cut to the chase. I would think that the core of the Second Amendment is actually that you are able to own the weapons most common to infantry service at your time. Like I think that would be like if you were to ask me like what is the most protected gun under the Second Amendment, my immediate reaction would be like, well, if we're gonna do an original analysis, it has to be an AR-15, and it's
Mhm.
probably a select fire AR-15 because that's the common kit of the modern infantryman is a select fire rifle. Um, so that would be your core right under this is like it would be, and like why is it protecting arms most useful in military service? It's because of this like strong connection between the free militia and republicanism that all these people had, and not just the free militia and republicanism because it goes a little deeper than that. It's actually a a close connection which the ancients had, a lot of societies have had, of like free men and who like have political rights as actors in their society. They get to be armed. Like
Right.
that goes alongside it. Like one of the, this is like not a case that anyone ever wants to bring up as an example for like how people thought, but it's actually useful. Like if you look at Dred Scott, like one of the reasons that they bring up, like that they think that he can't be a citizen, is like, well, this would give him the right to bear arms, which like you could say, okay, well that's incredibly racist, but no, but that even if it is, like that is how they thought. Like they just thought, oh, like citizenry and like bearing arms, like these things are just intimately connected. Like free men get to bear arms, and not only that, in the English tradition, free men kind of have to bear arms.
Yeah.
Like English militia law is very, very old. There were different classes of society were supposed to hold certain types of arms and armor, and based basically on your income level, which was judged by property at the time. So, like the least amount you were supposed to have under like the 14th century laws, I believe, is like you got to have a spear and like a heavy quilted jacket. Like you had to have those two things if you had a minimal amount of property. Um, so like this idea, it's like okay, so free men get to bear arms, and not only that, free states should rely on free men bearing arms, not on these standing mercenary armies, because the mercenary army, like different takes on it. One is that it's inherently dangerous. The other is that it kind of degrades. Um, this term kind of comes more out of more modern discourse, and you really don't see it being used at the time. But like what we would now probably call like Republican virtue, like since we people have been since influenced by like the classical Republican discourse of like the 70s and forward on this.
Yes. Yes. So, so, so that's kind of where we'd stand in terms of the conception of the militia and the right to bear arms, what exactly that means. You also mentioned rejecting the idea of a right to rebellion, right? And this is
Yeah.
sort of again popular culture, especially libertarian or conservative commentators often brings this up. There's definitely a paranoid strain of Second Amendment advocacy on the right in the United States that is kind of always making the case on the grounds of like, well, we need to. The reason for having the militia is to defend against a tyrannical government, right?
Yeah.
And that's not entirely outside of the realms of what would have been understood by the Constitution or by the writers, the authors of the Constitution. But you're saying that it's not exactly what's of concern in the Second Amendment here.
Yeah. Like once again, like I think like you could find people at the founding who would have thought a little bit more in this way. like I think definitely like I don't think he has this explicit idea about the Second Amendment, but if you like explain to Thomas Jefferson, oh, you know what, we think of the Second Amendment as like codifying this right to rebellion, like Jefferson might go, oh yeah, that's like he might be the person. But I think actually John Adams is the more normal person. Like he even represents a lot of the anti-federalists had the same sort of reservations about this idea about it being a right to rebellion. But Adams has this line. He's like, to suppose that arms in the hands of citizens to be used at individual discretion, except in private defense, is to demolish every constitution. So he had this idea. It's like, well, no, like you want individuals to have arms and you want them to be able to use them in private self-defense, but there's no sort of like natural right to unorganized persons to go out and rebel against the government. And you're like, well, didn't you, Mr. Adams, did not you do that? Were you not the person who was like most enthusiastic about declaring independence? And I think the division that he would have given is like, well, no, the American Revolution was an organized movement that appealed to its legal rights. Like it went through a process. Like a lot of people don't understand. It's like there's an early stage of the revolution where most of the complaints that are addressed and most of the stuff that's happening is addressed against Parliament, and it's requesting that the Crown step in and restrain Parliament from infringing upon their rights,
Hmm.
because they sort of had this conception was like that was the duty of the crown.
Right.
Because if you look at like the Bill of Rights of 1689 from the Glorious Revolution, like those are rights that the people have from and against the crown. They aren't rights really against Parliament, but they would have thought of the crown as being a guarantor of those rights. So if
Yes.
Parliament was overstepping them and was doing so for an enormous period of time, the crown is supposed to step in and restrain Parliament. Would have been how many people thought. Like not everyone, but many people would have thought like that was the role of the crown in that case. And that's definitely how a lot of the in a lot of the early stages of the revolution, people are petitioning the crown is to step in and restore the rights of Englishmen.
Yeah, yes. So you have this complicated relationship then between the early revolutionaries and their conception of themselves as being in rebellion. I think this alliance between the common people and or the non-nobility and the crown against the nobility is something that's like underappreciated in modern times, which is like in some ways there's less distance between the non-nobility and the crown than there is between the nobility and the crown because the nobility and the crown are in competition with each other over the same
Yeah,
things. Whereas and the crown has certain obligations to the non-nobility. Um, and yeah, and is sort of seen as a kind of guarantor or protector uh, of them against the nobles,
yeah,
who are sort of this kind of self-interested aristocratic class. Oddly enough, this tripart division of power was brought up in a talk that Curtis Yarvin gave at Urbit Subassembly back last October when he was re-entering the Urbit Foundation. And for those of you who are interested, you can go find it on the Urbit YouTube channel. The talk is posted there. But when he was re-entering the Urbit Foundation and coming in to take it over again, there was a lot of there were mixed feelings about the king sort of being back, right, back in charge, and being put in charge of the Urbit Foundation. And in this talk, he sort of comes out. It's a great talk for those of you who are interested. He comes out and he says, you know, historically, there's this deeper connection between the king and the non-nobles than the nobles, and the king is in competition with the nobles. And he basically lays out this case that what had happened with Urbit to put them in the position where they were, which around this time was close to running out of money, was that the nobles, i.e., the Urbit developers or the individual contributors who were receiving grants from the Urbit Foundation to build out the platform, had kind of gone astray and were no longer serving the non-nobility that is building apps that actually users wanted to use. and that the king was re-entering as a monarch to get the nobles in order and tell them that they have to start serving the people again, which I thought was a great talk and a good example of this dynamic.
Yeah, this is actually brings me to another point, which is really funny to like another way in which we're really separated from the founding generation is that like when we tend to talk about the separation of powers today, like we talk about it in this like very arcane, like sort of game theoretical sense that like, oh, we're just like balancing out these like abstract elements and like that's going to somehow lead to better governance. But it's much more organic how people talked about it historically. Like they really thought of it as balancing class interests.
Hmm.
They're like, oh, you need like an oligarchic element, you need a democratic element, you need a monarchical element, and you need to like put these things somehow in tension to where they like can work together, but they're still in some competition, like maybe not too much competition. Like John Adams, like he actually advocates during the revolution, he encourages all the states to adopt bicameral legislatures, and it's not for like you might think, oh, well, that makes sense because the Senate is the oligarchy and the House is the democracy, and there is some truth to that, and this does come up. I mean, it's why they call it the Senate. Like they knew very well what they were doing, but Adams also makes the case where he's like, well, no, bicameral legislatures are also preferable because they reduce the amount of friction between the executive and the legislature. Basically, the legislature is less likely to try to contest for executive power if it's also divided within itself.
Hmm. Yeah. Right, right. So so back to the right to rebellion, right?
Mhm.
Um, if we remove the right to rebellion and well, not remove, but we de-emphasize the right to
Yeah,
rebellion. And we also sort of bolster this militia-based argument. Um, where does this leave the self-defense component? Now, obviously, there's still, I think these cases, I mean, in this case, you have DC sort of, you know,
yeah,
taking a pretty extreme approach, right?
yeah, yeah. For those,
Um,
yeah, for those not aware of the background to Heller, like DC had an incredibly restrictive handgun law, and it wasn't even that just you couldn't own it wasn't that you couldn't own a handgun. It was like the conditions under which you could hold a handgun were so restrictive it made it useless. It had to be essentially like I don't think it had to be disassembled, but I believe you had to keep like it unloaded. I don't believe you could even keep the magazines loaded. I don't remember the exact details. It's been a while since I've read the statute at issue, and you had to keep different parts separated in such a way that like if you were in a situation where you had to engage in self defense in the home, the amount of time it would take you to get your weapon ready would render it practically useless.
yeah.
And I do think that it is correct in Heller to reject that as unconstitutional. Like I do think that is clearly infringing on the constitutional like, but is it infringing on like the right to bear arms? Is it infringing on the Second Amendment part of the Constitution, or is it actually more infringing upon like the Constitution is like also assuming like this wider body of common law? And like that's an entirely different judicial debate. Like there are people like this goes back to some of the ideas that like go way back to like the Erie case. Like, is there such a thing as like general laws? Like, are what is the scope of things that are incorporated by the Constitution? Like, people have knocked down, drag out arguments about that to this day. Um, but I'm okay with, I think like it would be a legitimate development of the Second Amendment to say, well, no, it also kind of like codifies also this common law about self defense. And I think you could probably come up with a pretty good case for that. Like if you looked at the case law around the Second Amendment, the problem is like the case law is relatively sparse until
Mm,
the 20th century because there just aren't federal regulations
yeah.
on point. Like no one is like the federal government doesn't step in and make any major regulations until the 1930s. So what are people going to do? Like one of the 19th century cases like has to do with um, Illinois demanding that only the National Guard can drill without the governor's permission. So the question is like, oh, can Illinois regulate when the militia goes out to drill? And the Supreme Court says, yeah, they can do that because the state is free to regulate how the militia practices. But of course, like Illinois wasn't telling people you can't own rifles, you can't own guns, you can't do any of that. I mean, the Second Amendment is so loose in the 19th century that people own artillery.
Yeah.
Like, you don't,
Return.
I mean, like, you don't, like, people often go, like, oh, well, the founders didn't intend for you to own a tank. And then you, like, look at how people practiced the Second Amendment historically. And it's like, well, everyone thought you could own the equivalent of a tank.
Yeah.
Like during the Texas Revolution, one of the two cannons that they had in service was because the citizens of Cincinnati got together, not as a government, but just as an independent group of interested people, had a cannon made and shipped to the Texians to use against to use against the Mexican government.
Yeah. As they should have. No.
Yeah.
Uh yeah, I would be remiss not to mention one of my former guests, Jessica Solche, is a documentarian. She did a documentary called Death Athletic on Cody Wilson, the Cody Wilson case around the around the Second Amendment right to 3D print guns.
Mm-hmm.
And this is again another area of like broad contention that has to do with just sort of the sophisticated, in this case, means of manufacture and you know, uh, and classification of modern weaponry, and whether or not the Second Amendment has any protections around that, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
there were also First Amendment reasons for uh, 3D printed blueprints of guns, being made available.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this whole area it basically this is a discourse that will probably always be going on so long as the government is interested in regulating people's access to various firearms and other weapons.
Yeah. I've thought about the 3D printed issue before. And like once
Yeah.
again,
What's your
I don't
take?
know what like your optimal policy is around 3D printed guns. Like
Yeah.
you could sit down and convince me that like yeah, actually like this is a step too far. It's like way too easy for like any non-skilled individual to like just assemble a firearm. Like you could maybe convince me of like there's some issue there. But if you're just going to say, hey, well, we're going to look at what the meaning of this amendment is and like what historical regulations have been in place and things like that. And it's hard for me to come away with like that as being something that would have like shocked the framers out of like wanting a Second Amendment. Uh, because I would say like you probably just look at like, how well distributed gunsmithing knowledge was, things like that. If you just looked at the historic American practice of manufacturing arms and how there was essentially no regulation over that practice until the 1930s. And you can even say, like, well, that might be a strength of America was that we did just like rampantly let people innovate on arms all they wanted without any government oversight.
Mhm.
Um, like it's very hard for me to say like if you're interested in what the original meaning of the Second Amendment is and what the original meaning of like America's discourse around arms is, like I don't see how 3D printing a gun is radically out of step with that history.
Yeah, the my hobby horse the last couple of years has actually been drones, where I'm very dissatisfied with the regulations on citizen ownership of drones as well as anti-drone weapons,
Yeah,
because those are like as we're seeing from the Ukraine war in particular, like small firearms are not totally useless, but they're not doing a lot. Like infantry
yeah,
have a really hard time defending against drones, and so if you can't have your own drones and you can't also possess anti-drone weapons, which are highly regulated,
yeah,
you practically can't have a functional infantry. I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah, in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think this is a much better case than there's a much better case for what Scalia is saying in Heller about like advances in technology might have wiped out like the ability of a citizen militia to be effective. Like I think like now with drones you actually have a much better case of making that argument because it's so hard to operate in the field. And then like your only recourse would be to say, well, yeah, people can own drones. But then what you might be able to say is, so this is interesting. Like what you might be able to say is like, yeah, people can own drones, but your ability to exercise the practice of operating the drone, like that can be regulated by the government in the same way that like militia drilling was regulated by the government. But once again, like that comes up with like a very interesting thing because okay, well, Illinois regulated how organized militias could go and drill, but like they weren't preventing you from doing target practice out on your farm. So, like, if you're going to say that drones are protected by the Second Amendment, like, what sort of practice are you allowed to do with a drone that like makes that right to hold the drone meaningful?
Yeah.
And because I mean, there's there's this entire aspect where now we have like this modern regulatory state, and a lot of things that we think of as are legitimately weapons also like run up against these other elements of the regulatory state. Like drones collide with the FAA. They also collide with the FCC because you need some way to communicate from the operator to the drone. Some anti-drone weapons definitely,
Yeah.
run afoul of the FCC. So, like, what are you allowed to do? Are those regulations inherently a problem because they run up against these Second Amendment issues? If you want to go this far, or are there carve-outs that you can create in order to protect what you think is like the Second Amendment? And like I would say, like once again, I think my view of the original meaning is relatively radical. But even then, like I would say, like my vision of it is like almost like somewhat restricted, even from the what was probably the founding idea. Whereas, like I would say, like yeah, it's arms most useful in infantry service. Whereas, like they probably wouldn't have done that caveat about infantry service. They probably would have just thought like, oh, anything that's commonly used in the military, like sure you can have it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So we're in a brave new world here, and well, it's exciting to see what continues coming out. Um, Kyle, what else can people hope to see from you from the Horizons review? Um, what can we expect next?
yeah, so Cody is giving me a reading list. We're gonna do an episode, sort of a wide-ranging episode, talking about Benedict the XVI's views on the Book of Genesis, like getting in a little bit to sort of like some of like the revisiting some of the like we'll go all the way back to the aughts and we'll relitigate creationism versus evolution one last time. But no, we're also going to talk some more about epistemology
I
and
don't know
like
about one last
Botany.
time, but
Yeah, 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 yeah. We could only hope, right? Uh, but yeah, we're going to talk about some of those things. It's sort of a grab bag. Cody's sort of building up the reading list for that episode. Um, Definitely have some other ideas. I've been talking to other guests to come on and talk about different things. I did do one episode with a friend, but like I'm still relatively new to this. He was completely new to it. It was just like it didn't come out well, and I'm probably going to revisit it. He might come on again, and we'll talk about something else. Trying to convince another friend of mine to come on and maybe do some talk about poetry.
oh, interesting.
Um,
Man,
yeah,
you guys are all over the place.
and like yeah, I mean to me this is like a grab bag of like here are interesting things that have interesting ideas that might like promote you like provoke you to think in a little bit different way. um like that's my only goal, and also once again I'm just doing what I think is fun because to revisit
Yeah,
what I said
yeah.
earlier, like I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't fun on some level.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, Kyle. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you.